Canada is interesting in that it gained its independence from their colonial overlords extremely gradually, unlike their southern neighbors and their violent revolution. Thus, the day that Canada became a country is largely left up to interpretation. Growing up in Canada, I've heard of so many points in history that people call the moment Canada became a country, and in this video, I'll be sharing these moments in history. In Canada's earliest days of colonization, they were a French colony along the St. Lawrence River. But, as France was defeated in the 7 Years' War, England took over the lands and created two smaller colonies, Upper and Lower Canada. And yes, Upper Canada is further south than Lower Canada. This is because of the way that the St. Lawrence River flows. To get to Upper Canada, you would have to sail upstream, hence Upper Canada. Anyways, these two colonies were made separate due to their demographics. In Upper Canada, there was a recent influx of British royalists from the American War of Independence, and just regular English colonists. This made the previously French-dominant colony majority English, while in Lower Canada, the people remained heartily French and wanted to stay that way. So, two different colonies were made, with Upper Canada having an English style of administration, while Lower Canada enjoyed a French style. This was changed when the Canadian Revolution sprang up across both colonies, that were separate, but very much similar in their reasonings. These reasons were primarily political changes, towards a more representative democracy in the colonies. These rebellions were crushed. But the English didn't want any further rebellions to spring up, and so sent Lord Durham into the Canadas to make a list of reforms that could be done to the colonies to reduce the risk of further revolution. One of the suggested changes was the unification of Lower and Upper Canada into one colony, and in 1841, the two colonies were merged into one Canada. I feel like this is obvious as to why some consider this the moment Canada became a nation, as it's the first time in history that we see one unified Canada, and this colony is the basis for everything Canada is today. Without the merging of these two colonies, we wouldn't see a unified Canada, and instead maybe two nations, a Francophone and an Anglophone Canada, but with much different borders, and severe changes to Anglophone-Francophone relations in the New World. For a long time after this unification, the lands of Canada we know today remained in several separate colonies, with separate governments. These colonies being Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, Prince Edward Island, New Brunswick, Canada, Rupert's Land, the Northwest Territories, and British Columbia. Between the maritime colonies, there was an idea to unite into one state, and Britain supported this idea readily, as the cooperation between these colonies would help them become less financially dependent on Britain. This culminated in the Charlottetown Conference. But once the colony of Canada heard of this conference, they requested to be included in the discussion of uniting. The colony was allowed to attend, with representatives from the provinces of Quebec and Ontario. At the conference, there was no solid conclusion on the union, as there were several roadblocks delaying things, such as Prince Edward Island not wanting a confederation, the other maritime colonies scared that they would have no governmental power, and Newfoundland not being able to attend. But fundamental foundations were set, paving the way for great things in the near future. One of the men at the conference representing Ontario, John A. Macdonald, played a key role in forming positive relations with his counterparts from the other colonies. A few months later, the Quebec Conference would take place, and here, the delegates agreed on a confederation between the colonies, with a healthy balance between federal and provincial power, quelling the maritime fears of lack of representation. But during this process, Prince Edward Island rejected the Confederacy, and Newfoundland only sent observers, not voting delegates. So, in the final resolution, these two colonies were excluded. In the end, the colonies agreed on 72 resolutions on how this united Canadian colony would run, and during the London Conference of 1867, the British agreed on this confederacy and drafted the British North America Act, and on the 1st of July 1867, the Canadian men returned to their new home of the Dominion of Canada, with their Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald. This is the most prominent moment that is considered the formation of the Canadian nation, as July 1st is Canada Day, or, as it was formerly known, Dominion Day. While not the date that all of Canada became united, or even the day of severed colonial ties with the British, It was the moment that these Canadian men came together in mutual agreement to form the beginnings of what we know as Canada. And this new status of dominion rather than colony gave Canada significant independence from the British in internal affairs. The first Prime Minister of Canada, John A. Macdonald, had a vision of a nation stretching from coast to coast, and this goal would have to include the colony of British Columbia and Rupert's Land. One of these lands was incorporated fairly easily, as Canada bought Rupert's Land from the Hudson's Bay Company for around 300,000 British pounds. The British Columbians were in favor of joining the Confederation, but were afraid that they wouldn't be given equal representation. So, a list of demands was sent to the Canadian government for the qualifications for them to join the Confederation. Macdonald knew that the region was rich in resources, and had a lot of potential to open Canada to many new trade markets, and so accepted the demands without question. One of the demands was to have a road from the east coast to the west coast, but seeing an opportunity here, Macdonald one-upped the British Columbians, and began the construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway. This was an expensive venture, as Canada is over 5,000 kilometers long from coast to coast, and this railway would be going through mostly unsettled, untamed land, which varies from the Rockies in the west to the tens of thousands of lakes in Manitoba. But this was worth it in the eyes of the Prime Minister, as a railway would exponentially speed up the process of settling the western lands of Canada, and allowed for the government to easily bring back the plenty of valuable raw materials. And so, after a scandal, and extensive surveying to find the path of least resistance, construction began. But this too saw many, many issues, from rerouting, to paying off Native Americans, to general financial problems. Immigrant Chinese and Native American workers were exploited heavily by the government, as they were forced to work the most difficult terrains, specifically in the Rockies, and were paid significantly less than their European counterparts. Despite all of the hardships, the railway was eventually finished after 5 long years in 1885, and the last spike was driven in by Donald Smith, the company director of the Canadian Pacific Railway. This moment was immortalized in this photo, with a notably significant lack of non-white workers. The completion of this railway signified the unification of Canada from east to west, and allowed for the future development of Canada as one nation, rather than some separate colonies working for themselves. This signified the opening of the prairies, which allowed for Canada to sell off the land to immigrant populations, allowing for them to cultivate the land, and increasing the meager population of Canada. In foreign policy, the Canadians were subordinate entirely to Britain, and so, as the First World War started, Canada was pulled in by Britain. Yet, in this war, Canada proved themselves as adept fighters that the Germans learned to fear. This skill has been attributed to many factors, one of which being that Canadians were largely disconnected from their European roots of military traditionalism, and generally looked at obstacles differently than the Europeans. This allowed for the Canadians to break many deadlocks along the Western Front that had been at a stalemate for months, if not over a year. The primary example of this, that many Canadians find a sense of pride in, is the Battle of Vimy Ridge. Vimy Ridge was an impressive defensive position for the Germans that seemed impregnable, but was successfully attacked by the Canadian soldiers. Back at home, Canadians felt a sense of nationalistic pride after reading victory after victory in newspapers, and this nationalism is why many call Vimy Ridge the birth of a nation. Not that birth of a nation, a less racist one. Generally, colonies were expected to be worse at combat, but Canada's fighting skill bought them a seat at the Versailles Treaty. This war really brought Canadians together, and founded a strong sense of nationalism across the whole country. Besides the Ukrainians put in internment camps, and Quebecois and Indigenous people having a separate identity altogether. And the fact that Canada signed this treaty separate from Great Britain showed the world that they were a nation not entirely ruled by their colonizer, and could fend for themselves when the time came. It also showed that Canada would be recognized for the hard fighting that they did, rather than be grouped as a subsection of the British Army. The First World War and following years were integral for Canada and other colonies in gaining further independence from Britain, and this was only solidified by the Balfour Report. Alongside many other things, the Balfour Report determined that the colonies of Great Britain should be constitutionally equal to Great Britain. By this time, Canada had already been doing many things that they were technically not allowed to do to spite Great Britain, and they hoped to force their colonizers into giving them more privileges, mostly in foreign policy. What followed was the Statute of Westminster, which basically made Canada independent, apart from the fact that Britain could amend their constitution. This was a proud moment for Canada, and to prove to the world that Canada was no longer a British puppet, the nation waited a week once Great Britain had declared war on Nazi Germany to do so themselves. This statute serves as the first time Canada held almost total control over their own autonomy, and was the furthest the nation had ever been from being a colony. Some argue that this was the event that pushed Canada from a colony to an independent sovereign nation. Since the Statute of Westminster, Canada still held ties to Great Britain, as they could amend the Constitution. To break these final ties, Canada formed the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which was part of the Constitution Act. This charter constitutionally defined many rights of citizens, with the goal of uniting the mosaic of Canadians under one document. Before this, the Constitution of Canada was written by Britain, in Britain, for Canada. So, in establishing this document, the Canadians were expressing their self-determination by writing something by Canadians, for Canadians. In the larger Constitution Act, the British were stripped of their power to amend the Canadian Constitution, and in 1982, Queen Elizabeth came to the Canadian Parliament to sign the act herself. It is so clear as to why this could be considered the day Canada became a nation, as now they were totally independent from any colonial involvement or potential involvement in their politics and government. From the origins of Canada, Québécois have felt disaffected and undermined by the majority of Anglophones in Canada. These frustrations peaked during the FLQ crisis, where the Front de Libération du Québec, or Quebec Liberation Front, a separatist terrorist organization, exploded bombs all over Quebec City and even kidnapped a government official in hopes that the nation would set the province free. Federally, this crisis was met with a heavy hand by the government, as they arrested many without evidence or trial, and had the military called in and use excessive force. But the measures taken by the government only showed the people of Quebec how readily their rights were infringed upon by the government, especially as the Prime Minister at the time, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, enacted the War Measures Act and expressed that he was willing to go to any lengths to destroy the FLQ. The people of Quebec became more and more upset with the government as years went by, and had been campaigning for a referendum on independence for a long time now. In 1995, the government allowed for the referendum to take place, and as the results came in, the margins were very, very slim, with Québécois only voting to stay by 60,000 votes, just over 1% of the total vote. For many, this was the death of the independence movement, and the final decision that Canada should remain whole, which is expressed in the steady decline in the popularity of the independence movement in the following years. This was formative for Canada, and while an unpopular opinion, I personally believe that Canada gained its true nationhood after this referendum, with the Québécois finally deciding to work alongside Canada for their interests, rather than against the grain. It truly defined Canada as a whole, rather than the sum of its parts, and that's the nationhood of Canada highlighted.